1, 0, 0, and liftoff.
Hey guys, welcome to another episode of Filter. On this show, we recognize that the world can be a confusing place to live in. And so what I seek to do in this show is to equip you to live with biblical clarity in our confusing world, so that you can face the chaos of life with wisdom, integrity, and courage. My guest on today's episode is a returning guest. He is Neil Shenvi. Neil has an A.B. in chemistry from Princeton and a Ph.D. in theoretical chemistry from UC Berkeley. He is the author of Why Believed, a reasoned approach to Christianity, and is widely recognized for his writing on critical theory, which can be found in journals like Eikon and the Journal of Christian Legal Thought. He is married and has 4 children. Neil, welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you, Aaron.
Well, glad to have you back on. I've been looking forward to it. I've been looking forward to the release of this new book, which was co-authored with Pat Sawyer, so we'll give Pat a shout out. But as we get started, just tell me, how did you get into studying critical theory? What's the story behind that?
Interesting story. So I began getting interested in this subject about 6 years ago, 5 or 6 or 7 years ago, around the time I finished up the first draft of my first book, Why Believe, and I was looking around for some other project to tackle, and that was around the time that Black Lives Matter really took off as an organization. And I began to see a shift in our culture and how the culture and the church was talking about issues like race, class, and gender. And I couldn't quite put my finger on what was wrong with it. Something seemed off, but I couldn't figure out what. Well, providentially, around that time, I met Pat, so my co-author Pat Sawyer, who was getting his Ph.D. in Education and Cultural Studies at UNC Greensboro. And he came over at my house one day because we both shared an interest in apologetics. We had a mutual friend who went to our church, and so we hung out for like 6 hours. He came over at like 7 o'clock at night, and he left at like 1 a.m. or 2 a.m. or something. But during that conversation, I found out that he was doing research in the critical tradition, that his PhD dissertation would end up being in the field of critical pedagogy. When he explained his research to me, I suddenly thought, this is what I'm seeing. This sort of framework is what is erupting in the culture and even within evangelicalism. So starting with that relationship, I began reading extensively on critical theory and relying on Pat to sort of guide my reading and help me understand things that were going on. So we've been collaborating for more or less 5 or 6 years now, writing together, speaking, and now finally publishing this book on critical theory and social justice ideology.
Yeah, that's great. And I've been reading your blog for several years. I was seeing a lot of the same trends that you were talking about earlier, and confused, concerned by them. I could recognize that there was some different worldviews that were behind these trends that I knew I disagreed with, but I didn't know exactly what it was, or couldn't articulate why I had grounds for disagreement until I found your blog, and it really, really helped me. Can you just give some more specific examples of the kind of trends that you had been seeing in evangelicalism and in the culture that then led you to seeing critical theory as being the driving force behind it?
Mm-hmm. So actually our first chapter is illustrative because we have just, 20 or 30 examples of quote-unquote wokeness, both in the culture and in the evangelical church. So one example from the culture very prominent would be in 2020, the Smithsonian Institute published an infographic on aspects and assumptions of whiteness and white culture. They had a list of all these different elements of whiteness. And they included things like the scientific method, objective, rational, linear thinking is an element of whiteness and white culture. Ideas like hard work is the key to success is an element of whiteness. And you'd expect to see things like that in a neo-Nazi manifesto, but not from the Smithsonian Institute's. And actually, it was to top it all off, that was in their Museum of African American History and Culture, this purportedly anti-racist organization promoting this crazy stuff. And they took the infographic down after an outcry. But you're like, what in the world is that? Who thinks that hard work to get success is a white thing? That's really actually, that's kind of racist.
Yeah.
So that's an example from the culture. Another one would be Blue's Clues. In 2021, during Pride Month, the television program Blue's Clues, which is targeted at preschoolers, it's helping them learn like simple words and numbers and shapes, and it's aimed at kids that are 3 through 6. But they had a cartoon video featuring a drag queen singing a song to the tune of the Ants Go Marching, and it had a whole parade, like a pride parade, and the lyrics talked about asexual, bisexual, and pansexual grown-ups. One of the cartoon characters was a beaver with double mastectomy scars. So it was a female beaver that had cut off the beaver's breasts.
Wow.
That was in the video. And this is for 4-year-olds. And you're like, how did we get here? So that would be in the culture. And then in the church, so we also saw things happening in the church. So one of the prime examples would be Dr. Christina Cleveland. So I wrote a book called Disunity in Christ in 2013. There's a very sort of moderate, almost evangelical Christian take on uniting across lines that divide us, like politics or race or education. So it's a pretty normal, it's filled with scripture. It's a pretty nondescript book, not objectionable, really. And in 2016, she wrote a column for Christianity Today. So a very prominent evangelical figure. She spoke at Cru conferences. She spoke at InterVarsity conferences. So again, major evangelical figure. That was 2016, 2017. Well, in 2022, she published a book called God is a Black Woman, where she just it's clear that she's totally renounced the Christian faith and that she no longer worships a being that she calls white male God, all in one word, lower letters, and that she now worships the sacred black feminine. And the book is structured around her pilgrimage to France, where she goes to worship and pay homage to and to caress these black Madonna statues that represent to her. She christens them like the Lady of Our Lady of the Side Eye and Our Lady of All Bling, and She Who Cherishes Our Hot Mess, and just give these names to these statues that she's worshiping now. So that's an extreme example, but there are many other evangelical figures who 10 years ago, even 5 years ago, were conservative evangelicals and were platformed by major evangelical organizations that have really just either completely apostatized or have embraced essentially progressive Christianity. So, and then we have examples in the book, but it's not really the book's not about people. It's not about these individuals that are, these are the bad apples. No, our point is that there are these ideas in the culture that are at the root of these crazy outbursts we're seeing. And to really then to counter that movement, we have to counter the ideas.
Yeah, and so these ideas, like you said, are in our mainstream culture now. Everything from, they're in Blue's Clues, as you pointed out, which I didn't know that female beavers had breasts to be removed. But
well, they're mammals, right? So they gotta have mammary glands.
So, so they're in everything from Blue's Clues to mainstream news, politics. It's in the mainstream now, and in anything that people today would identify as woke, right? But what you discovered and what you write about in this book is that these ideas, they didn't start in the mainstream culture, but they had their start somewhere else, and then they worked their way into our mainstream culture through a host of studies that are kind of often lumped together as critical theory. And one of the first things you guys address in the book is that it's the first challenge is really just naming what these giving a name to these ideas so that they can be critiqued. And what often ends up happening, and I've read your Twitter threads and blog posts where you go back and forth in these kind of debates. What often ends up happening is you just get into this argument over semantics, and you trying to address some ideas, and people just dismissing your objections and critiques because you're not calling it the right name. And so that's the first thing you guys approach in this book is just what do we call this? Like, what do we name it? Because there's a whole host of studies and personalities and ideas that go into what people typically call critical theory and wokeness. So how do you guys approach that problem so that you can critique these ideas?
In our book, we talk about this problem. So, 5 years ago, people were talking about cultural Marxism, or Jordan Peterson talked about postmodern neo-Marxism, or people talk about today critical race theory or intersectionality. They have all these terms. The problem is that, as you said, when you get in a conversation with, say, a progressive about, well, what's wrong with the culture, or the ideas that are at fault, whatever you call this ideology, they'll say it's the wrong label. You can't, oh, don't call it cultural Marxism. That's a neo-Nazi conspiracy theory, even though it actually goes back decades to academia. But they'll say, well, you can't use that term. Well, can I call it wokeness? Well, no, that's actually an African-American vernacular term, and you're appropriating their culture, and it's racist. You can't use that term. Can I call it critical race theory? Well, that's just a legal theory that's taught only in graduate schools. Well, can I call it intersectionality? Well, that's just a legal concept. So whatever you say, whatever you call it, they'll tell you it's the wrong term. It's really just a semantic shell game. They want to avoid discussing the ideas, and so if they keep you using different labels, and they can avoid ever talking about the ideas. So to avoid that strategy, we have coined a newish term that we call contemporary critical theory. So there's no question these ideas are rooted in something called critical theory, or the critical tradition that goes back to Karl Marx, but has evolved tremendously in the last 150 years. So it goes back to Marx through the Frankfurt School in the 1920s and 30s, people like Antonio Gramsci, Max Horkheimer, then 1960s, the New Left in the UK, Kimberly Crenshaw and critical race theory, Derek Bell in the 1980s and 1990s. And then in modern queer theory is a critical social theory. So the point is there are all of these different streams of thought in this critical tradition. And these ideas are coming from that stream of philosophy. But then it's the ideas that are affecting our contemporary culture most dramatically. So we've chosen to call this contemporary critical theory. If people insist on calling it something else, they can, but we want to say let's focus on the ideas. These ideas are false, they are unbiblical, and they are dangerous. And so we want to pick those ideas out, no matter what you call them, and say these ideas are false and they must be rejected.
Yeah, and after you name it, then there's the recognition that, well, this is a humongous area of writings and people and ideas that you're diving into. Everything from, as you mentioned before, queer theory to critical pedagogy to critical race theory to all these different other ones. And so there's a lot going on here. But what you guys do in the book to try to approach it in a manageable way is you try to distill it down to, if I remember right, it was 4 kind of core similar ideas that you can then go from there to engage with it and critique it. What are those 4 common ideas that you see across the board among these contemporary critical theories?
Right. So the 4 ideas are, number 1, the social binary, number 2, hegemonic power, number 3, lived experience, and number 4, social justice. So let me go through each of those quickly. The social binary is the idea that society is divided into oppressor groups and oppressed groups along lines of race, class, gender, sexuality, physical ability, nationality, colonial status, and a host of other factors. So in every category, you have an oppressor group like whites or men or heterosexuals or Christians or physically able-bodied people or the young. So that's the oppressor group. And then in contrast, you have oppressed groups. People of color are oppressed. Women are oppressed. LGBTQ people are oppressed. Disabled people are oppressed. Fat people are oppressed. So you have the social binary of oppressor versus oppressed. Now, when you say that, occasionally people will ask, that doesn't make any sense. Well, how can that be the case? Like, oppression means, cruel treatment, tyranny, control, abuse of power. That's what in the dictionary oppression means. So how can you say that we live in the at the intersection of all these systems of oppression? I don't see them. Like, sure, there's injustice out there. I agree with that, but I don't walk around. I'm a woman, or I'm black. I don't walk around feeling like I'm constantly being oppressed and treated cruelly. So how can you say that's the case? Well, the second idea is called hegemonic power. So critical theorists have redefined the word oppression to include not just cruel treatment or tyranny, but also to include the ways in which the ruling class, whether it's whites or men or heterosexuals or Christians or the able-bodied, the ruling class has imposed their values on culture in a way that justifies their own power and privilege. And these norms and values that they've imposed on culture are so common and they so suffuse our culture that they're taken for granted as natural, as normal, as common sense, even as God ordained. And yet, all of these values and norms, they marginalize certain groups, and that constitutes oppression. So whenever you have some system of ideas, some ideology that's taken from the ruling class that justifies their own power at the expense of other people, well, that's oppression. So for example, white supremacy is this constellation of values and norms that supposedly marginalizes black people and people of color and therefore oppresses them. The patriarchy is a system of values and norms that oppresses women. Heterosexism is a system of values and norms that exalts heterosexuality and oppresses homosexual people and LGBTQ people. The gender binary is an idea that oppresses transgender people. So that's how they think about power, and hegemonic power refers to the ability of the ruling class to impose their values on culture. And that is what oppression has been redefined to include. Well, the question is, well, how do you escape those values and norms of the ruling class? And that's the third idea, is lived experience. The way that we can escape from these blinders that have been imposed on us by culture is through the lived experience of oppression. Now, of course, if you're in a dominant group, if you're part of that oppressor group, if you're white or male or heterosexual or Christian, well, you're blind to your privilege. So you don't have the experience of racism, sexism, classism, heterosexism to draw upon, and therefore you're kind of in the dark. But in contrast, people that are oppressed can through their lived experience of oppression, can realize that they're being oppressed and can wake up. They can get woke. They can achieve what's called a liberatory or critical consciousness that then allows them to articulate how oppression operates today. So because of that, if you are a dominant group member, so if you're a white or middle class, or you're male, or you're heterosexual, or you're Christian, well, you should defer to their authority that they possess by virtue of their lived experience, because they can see clearly, whereas you're still blinded. Then finally, the end goal and telos, the purpose of critical theory today, and is and always has been, social justice, which they would define as the elimination of the social binary. So they want to tear down the systems and structures that perpetuate this unjust ideologies and these unjust hegemonic discourses that marginalize some people. They want to tear those down so that we can achieve a state of diversity, equity, and inclusion. So that there's no more oppressive narratives, there's no more othering, there's no more dominant and oppressed groups, that all of us share power. So that's the end. That's the right side of history. You're working towards this state of liberation where people share power. So those are 4 big ideas. And if you think this is a very rough approximation, if you think about those 4 ideas, if you apply those 4 ideas to, say, race, you get critical race theory. If you apply those 4 ideas to gender and sexuality, you get queer theory. If you apply those 4 ideas, say, to teaching, you get critical pedagogy. If you apply those 4 ideas to colonial status, colonial and imperial status in nations, you get post-colonial theory. And that's a rough approximation. These subdisciplines have obviously different origins and different histories and different ideas. But broadly speaking, you can understand all of these subdisciplines in terms of those 4 core ideas.
Yeah, well, if you guys are listening and your brain is hurting to keep up with all that, then just know you're not alone. It's such a, I think for a lot of us, maybe this is increasingly not true, but for a lot of us, this way of thinking is so alien to the way that many of us were raised to think, values to hold, assumptions to hold. If I dare say it, it really does seem like an entirely different worldview. And I know that a lot of people on the other side of this debate have pushed back against using that term with critical theory. I guess before we move any further, what's your opinion there? Can we use the term worldview whenever we are discussing contemporary critical theory?
Yeah, I think we can. I think it's very fair. My co-author, Pat, likes to say that, critical theory in its most robust form, it makes claims about epistemology, that is, how do we know the truth through lived experience. It makes claims about ontology. What does it mean to be human in the world of the nature of our human experience? It makes claims about phenomenology, meaning what is our day-to-day experience of life and how is it shaped by social factors? It's making these really big claims. Or just take a look at how all of those categories encompass all of life. Race, class, gender, sexuality, physical ability, national stat. That's pretty much all of our social spheres are fit into that oppressor-oppressed grid. They're not trying to narrowly understand just one feature of social reality. They're trying to understand all of it. They're trying to understand how do you get at the truth about injustice. They're trying to get at things like what is just, What is unjust? What is oppression? These are big questions, and that's because of that, contemporary critical theory functions as a worldview. Another point that Pat likes to make is that, say, critical race theory, and we'll get into this probably later, but in its most robust sense, it wants to colonize more and more of your thinking. If you say, well, I'm just going to take critical race theory and I'm going to apply it only to, say, race, I'm going to use it as a narrow analytic tool. Well, the funny thing is that if you read the critical race theorists themselves, one of the defining elements of critical race theory since its inception, in 1993, going back way 30 years ago, they said that one of the defining elements is that critical race theory treats racism, sexism, and heterosexism as different forms of oppression, and that they're all interrelated. To undermine one, like racism, is to be against all of those things, and that we will need, I quote, massive social transformation to undermine all of these oppressions at the same time. That's a very early critical race theory document called Words That Wound, co-authored by the movement's co-founders, including Kimberly Crenshaw. And so they will tell you they're not aiming to just have this really tiny little slice of your mental landscape being occupied by. They want to expand that and say, no, you have to think of all of these issues, race, class, gender, sexuality, all of them in terms of, say, the social binary, all of them in terms of lived experience, all of them in terms of social justice. So I do think, and because it answers those big questions like, who am I? How do I know the truth? What is my purpose in life? What should I be doing with my time? What is the end goal for humanity? It's absolutely functioning as a worldview, and there always will be a battle then between, say, contemporary critical theory and some other worldview you might want to hold, like Christianity. They're going to fight for dominance in your thinking, in your emotional investment, in how you spend your resources, your time, where your heart is really. So we argue, in the book, you can't serve two masters. You're going to have to choose what you value most and what's going to be your regnant paradigm in thinking about social issues.
Yeah, wow. So would that explain why, if critical theory or contemporary critical theory is a worldview, would that perhaps help explain why we can witness so many people within evangelicalism who start out as biblical, orthodox, normal, middle-of-the-road evangelical, who begin to start, absorbing some of these ideas, particularly like on race relations matters, then slowly descending into, should we say, compromising on a lot of other biblical truths, particularly on homosexuality, gender, and so on.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we can see it in real time. If you actually, we quote her, but Christina Cleveland gave a lecture in 2019 about missions as the heroicization of whiteness to the Leslie Newbigin Summers Institute in the UK, I think. But in that talk, she says explicitly that her thinking about race has been framed by critical race theory, which in her words teaches that we all live within this oppressive ladder with straight white males at the top, and at the very bottom we have black trans women. And so it's just so clear that and that was 2019 even. That was before she wrote her book. That was when she was, I think at the time she might have still been professing that she was to be a Christian. But you can see how that way of thinking sort of percolated through not just her thinking about race, but gender, and then sexuality, and then really even religion. How do you think about God's role in the universe? Is he just, isn't he imposing his values on you? Isn't he telling you how to live? Isn't he claiming that his values and norms are good and natural and ordained by God because he's God, and he wants you to take them in and to live by? Well, what is that? Well, he's really actually imposing his value. He's an oppressor. He has a hegemonic discourse. In fact, the Bible itself is increasingly viewed as this oppressive hegemonic discourse that is naturalized and seen as normal, but really we have to get underneath it and debunk it. That's part of the work of social justice. Anyway, but yes, the short answer is yes, that absolutely you can see this trajectory in so many figures within evangelicalism and also outside. And it really is reflecting the fact that critical theory is functioning as a worldview.
Yeah, I think another way that we can see that working itself out in a really odd way is in the way that different expressions of wokeness, we'll just put it that way, kind of gather together these different subgroups of people that really don't hold that many common interests with one another, and sometimes even have contradictory interests with one another. Maybe you can help us to explain this, but recently we've seen this group called Queers for Palestine.
Yep.
That are supporting the Palestinian side of the conflict going on over there in Gaza right now. And if you understand the views on homosexuality within that part of the world, it seems to be a very self-defeating group to be in, Queers for Palestine. Nevertheless, I think if you understand how it's operating within a certain worldview, then within that worldview, it makes sense. Can you help us to make sense of all that?
Sure. So Kimberly Crenshaw is a critical race theorist, and really one of, I'd argue, the most important critical race theorists alive today. You could argue Derek Bell was more foundational. He was kind of the godfather of critical race theory, but Crenshaw, more than any other figure, is responsible for its prominence today. And really, her concept of intersectionality, which she introduced that term in two papers in 1989, 1991. So she introduced the concept of intersectionality as a way to argue that our identities are not simple. They're complex. We cannot be reduced to a single axis like race alone or gender alone. And that our experience of, say, race and gender is simultaneous. So the example that she gave was of, say, a black woman. A black woman can be discriminated against not merely because she's black or not merely because she's a woman, but because she's a black woman. She gave an example of a car company, a lawsuit that was filed on behalf of black women. I think it was GM. And these black women argued they were discriminated against because they were black women. And the defense was, well, we have lots of black people in our company and we have lots of women in our company. So your case is faulty. And Crenshaw argued, well, no, that's not the case, because you could have lots of black men and lots of white women, but you don't want to have black women in particular. And that's a fair argument, right? Maybe somebody really just doesn't like black women. And so you can be discriminated against not for only your race or only your gender, but for the combination of your races. So that narrow observation is, I think, it's valid. Of course you can be discriminated against for this intersection of factors. But what she did, though, was more broader than just that sort of narrow version of intersectionality. She wanted us to see the world in terms of these intersecting systems of oppression. So in that sense, black women were doubly oppressed. They were in this doubly oppressed category, and their identities were being shaped not merely by being black plus being a woman. They had this special discrimination and oppression they faced as black women. Now, what does that do? It means that first of all, you see solidarity with lots of different groups because you all are experiencing different oppressions. And so there is this immediate recognition that say, yes, I'm experiencing oppression because of race and you because of gender, but we both experience oppression. On the other hand, it tends to fracture alliances because a black woman and a white woman are differently socially situated. So she would argue, say, that feminism as a whole, the movement, was dominated by the interests of white middle-class women and not the interests of, say, minority women or poor women. And so there's a lot of debate within intersectional circles as to how do you foster solidarity without fracturing over these different identities. Anyway, the bottom line is that today, though, this intersectional lens has really taken over academia. And what happens today is, through this intersectional framework, you're uniting all these various subdisciplines. So, for example, today, if you pick up a textbook on critical race theory, there will be an entire chapter on gender and an entire chapter on LGBTQ issues. If you pick up a textbook on queer theory, you'll have an entire chapter on race or disability. Pick up a textbook on fat theory. That's actually what it's called. You'll find chapters on race and gender and sexuality. So intersectionality guarantees that all of these oppressions are treated simultaneously. And so that's why, for example, you see groups like, or signs like Queers for Palestine, or another sign says, reproductive justice is Palestinian justice. Climate justice is Palestinian justice. You're like, what? How do they have anything to do with each other? In fact, like you said, LGBTQ community is not actually being welcomed by, say, the average Arab person, right, who's pro-Palestine. But that's so what's going on. The answer is they're seeing everything through this intersectional framework, which would see them all as oppressed groups that need to unite to work for their freedom and liberation as oppressed groups.
Yeah. So there's a lot to be done there in just diagnosing and trying to understand what's happening with contemporary critical theory. Whenever we move to critique, let's first start by identifying what's the wrong way to approach critiquing contemporary critical theory. You guys talk about that in the book, some wrong ways to go about doing it and how we should properly critique contemporary critical theory. So let's start there. What would be the wrong ways to start critiquing this?
So there are a lot of mistakes that Christians and non-Christians can make. One is just to firebomb some term, like, oh, critical race theory, just firebomb it, get rid of it, that label's wrong, it's always bad, we're not going to use it anymore. And we point out that's just strategically a mistake, because what's going to happen, and already is happening, if you firebomb a term like critical race theory, people will just rename it. They'll just call it, well, we're not doing critical race theory anymore, we're doing anti-racism. Okay, well, I don't like that either. Well, no, we're not doing anti-racism, we're doing critical whiteness pedagogy. Well, I don't like critical, and it's like, it goes on and on. They just change the labels, and the same poisonous ideas are repackaged under a new label. So you have to attack the ideas. You can't just attack some term. Or they'll say, like, you don't understand that term, and it goes on and on. So you find, what are the ideas, though? That's number one. Another, I think, I'd say just generally speaking, Christians just haven't put in the work to understand the ideas. And this is very common. We have in the book several examples of people that ways in which people misunderstand what the theories are saying, and because of that, they give what they think are these gotcha zinger answers that actually don't work at all. Here, an example would be, I've seen conservatives talk about intersectionality, and they talk about how intersectionality breaks people down into smaller and smaller groups. You're not just black, you're a black woman. You're not just a black woman, you're a black poor woman. You're not just a poor black woman, you're a black disabled woman who's poor. So you get these narrow categories. So the conservative zinger is, well, the smallest category is the individual. So let's just protect individual rights, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that's a great point, but it's not, because intersectionality never sees people as individuals. In fact, they'll problematize individualism as whiteness. So they'll always see you, even if you're the only, poor, black, lesbian, Palestinian, only category, there's only one person that's you in that category, you're just a member of these multiple intersecting oppressed groups. You're still not an individual. So that's not the way the theories work. And conversely, if you're the only rich, straight, white, Norwegian billionaire who's an athlete, you're the only person in the world like that, you're just a member of multiple oppressor groups. That's all you are. You're not an individual. So that's just a wrong way to attack. So I think Christians and non-Christians, we have to really do our homework to understand what people are saying in order to challenge what they're saying. Not to make it okay, but to say you're going to take a wrong approach in critiquing it if you don't understand what they're actually saying. And then finally, I think in our book, we really bring out the fact that the reason that we're here as a culture, at least in part, is due to the history of slavery and racism in our country. We have a whole chapter on the history of slavery, black codes and Jim Crow, and modern day discrimination and racism, and how it's still a thing in our society. And that, because people have seen racism, and for a large part they abhor it, if you tell them, well, we're going to give you the way to solve racism, we're going to give you the magic bullet to solve it, they are so desperate for that I'll buy into whatever you're selling when it happens to be critical race theory. So if we want then to warn people about critical race theory, say, we have to not just show them that it's wrong, we have to show them a better approach to race. So in the book, we talk about our horrific racial history. We also show them a better way to approach race biblically. What does it mean? How should we think about it? How can we work towards racial unity? What are some basic theological truths that we can affirm about the unity of the human race, about whether or not ancestral guilt's a biblical category? It's not. But things like that we want to warn people about the dangers, but also give them a better, more biblical approach to thinking about these issues. So I think those are three things that we'd say are good ways to approach critiquing critical theory.
Yeah. And so when we begin to do these, the critiquing critical theory and doing these apologetics, are these apologetics that we're only doing towards the culture, or is this apologetics that we're also doing for the health of the church? In other words, is contemporary critical theory really a danger to the church? I know you gave an example of Dr. Cleveland earlier, but is that a good example of a danger to all of evangelicalism and to your everyday average congregation, or is that really something that's just happening in a couple of esoteric corners of Christian academia, something that really is no danger to the average church or person in a local congregation?
I mean, speaking personally, I think it's a hugely important issue for the church, the health of the church. I think that yes, the cases where you see someone actually just abandoning Christianity and apostatizing, those are fewer cases. But we definitely just do see a bigger drift towards progressive theology in response to embracing and imbibing these ideas that are drawn from critical theory. So again, this progression is often pretty consistent. It starts with embracing, say, these ideas about race that are infused with critical race theory and its way of thinking. But then, because critical race theory will push for it, it will say, hey, you can't just think about race, think about gender also. So you'll start thinking about in what ways are women oppressed by the patriarchy? Well, they've redefined the words oppression and patriarchy. So oppression now refers to any way in which the ruling class, meaning men, imposes their values on culture. Well, what about male eldership? About male leadership in the family, things like that. Isn't that, oh, but that's God ordained. Oh, exactly. You'd say that because you're trying to preserve your male power and privilege. So now we've gone from saying let's approach race this way to saying let's approach things like gender and female roles, male and female roles in the church and society, as approach that lens. Maybe let's approach the Bible through a feminist lens, not just through this sort of patriarchal lens. Because remember, lived experience is very important. We have to give the voice to feminist scholars that have been denied it. And if I say, well, the Bible says such and such, well, that's your white male interpretation of the Bible. That's not the Bible itself. And so then, of course, you apply that same lens to sexuality. How have heterosexuals imposed their heteronormative values on the culture and on the church? You're interpreting that passage in 1 Corinthians through your heterosexist lens, through your white male experiences, but really we ought to take a queer approach to scriptures. For example, we give examples in our chapters on queer theory, how some admittedly progressive Christians are now doing what they call queer theology, where they're applying the deconstructive methods of queer theory explicitly to historic Christian truths, things like about doctrines of sin and salvation, and of course, gender and sexuality. But it really is an acid that will eat away the very foundations of the Christian faith.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you. And that's why I asked the question, because I agree.
We have a section at the end of the book, in chapter 13, called "Ideas that will devastate your church." Mm-hmm. We give a bunch of slogans, I think 9 slogans, like, here's one: sin is oppression, right? And oh yeah, actually, I had a friend, a solid Christian, who said to me once, "Sin is oppression," and I was like, "Wait, what?" He's like, "Yeah, sin's oppression." But wait a minute. It's like, what about like idolatry, worshiping a statue? Who are you oppressing when you do that? And he's like, "Oh, I guess." I was like, "Well, wait a minute." He's like, "I never thought of that." I was like, "How could you have never thought of that?" He's like, but to him, it's like, it just sounds so reasonable. Of course,
yeah.
Christians are for social justice. What do you mean by that? Well, I don't know. Isn't it obvious? No, it's not obvious, guys. So we often begin by repeating these slogans without realizing what they even mean. And we get this vibe from the culture. Yeah, it's a good thing to say. But if you think about it really deeply, you're like, it's not what the Bible says about, say, sin. Of course, oppression, defined biblically, is a sin, but it's one of many sins. And not all sins involve horizontal oppression. Some sins just involve offending God. So the bottom line is that, yeah, these ideas are pernicious, and they often slip in because they fit the cultural zeitgeist, but we have to resist that.
Yeah. Yeah, I completely agree. And it's something that, just like you have witnessed online a lot, you can see it with different people various levels of platform, you can see a trajectory with them, and then I think many of us can have witnessed it just in our individual lives in different maybe Christian organizations that we've been a part of. I have a couple of good friends who have been really involved with major Christian ministries such as Crew and Young Life tell me story after story of people that they knew in those ministries, and it happens along that exact trajectory that you described a moment ago, where it begins with either social justice or race relations, and then just keeps going down from there to where it pretty much ends up with just a full deconstruction.
Get them this book. That's what we wrote this book as a resource for pretty much every evangelical Christian in the U.S. And and we mentioned this. We field inquiries from other continents, from India, from Africa, Kenya, Ghana, South Africa, the UK, Japan, because in every culture, critical theory just latches on to whatever is the most socially salient feature of division, whether it's here it's race in the US. In the UK, it's often colonial status. In India, it's the caste system. Apparently in Africa, it's tribe, but you have oppressor tribes and oppressed tribes. But it takes that social division and it uses that as a foot in the door to introduce an entire way of thinking. These people in Kenya are like, this is coming from the U.S. We hate it. Take it back. Stop exporting your poison to us. I'm like, I'm sorry. I agree. But it's not like it's isolated to the U.S. It's not like it's a Republican Democrat issue, because it's like, you go to India, they're like, what's a Democrat? They don't know, but it's there also. So we really have to approach this as these are insidious, pernicious ideas. They are parasitic. They will infect various cultures and destroy them from the inside. So we have to stamp them out. Yeah.
Yeah, and something that I really hope a lot of pastors out there equip themselves on, because as a pastor myself, I've seen what it can do, and had to deal with it in our church, and seeing how it always either ends in the person abandoning the woke positions and returning to biblically faithful views, or the person leaving their biblically faithful views. It's one or the other. No one ever just continues to hold on to one piece of the woke position and then maintain the rest of their biblical worldview. It's one way or the other. And so I hope a lot of pastors grab this book too. So how do you criticize? What are your critiques of those? And we can't go into the whole critique of all four of those main ideas that make up contemporary critical theory. But if we just chose one, perhaps let's do the number 4, the social justice. How do you guys critique that idea in contemporary critical theory and provide a better alternative in the Christian worldview?
So social justice, as defined by critical theorists, is all about dismantling the social binary, which is produced by these hegemonic discourses, these narratives about what's right and wrong, good or evil, what's natural, what's God ordained. And they see all of those things as mechanisms for the ruling class to preserve their power, and they have to be undermined. And we just respond by saying, but wait a minute, as Christians, we have to affirm there is an objective right and wrong. There are actual God-ordained norms that are good, that we should not dismantle. So, for example, the gender binary is God-ordained. God created us male and female. It's good to affirm that. We cannot change our sex. It's in our nature. And because of that, it would be actually unjust to dismantle the gender binary. Another example would be heterosexuality. God designed male and female to unite in marriage and to procreate. That's the nature of marriage. That's the nature of male and female. So it is not wrong or unjust to promote natural marriage. It is, in fact, a good and just thing for society to affirm that marriage is between one man and one woman in covenant. It's a reflection of Christ in the church. So those are 2 examples where you just, at the outset, say you're looking at this whole issue wrongly because you've denied the fact that God actually does have norms and values that are not ours or mine or yours, or they're not imposed on us by anyone but God. And we have to, as Christians, or take another example more broadly, Critical race theory believes that law is a mechanism for perpetuating white dominance. That's how it analyzes law. There are quotes we have in the book where critical race theorists say that critical race theory rejects the idea of some absolute transcendent standard of right and wrong. Law is just a human construct to perpetuate the privilege of the dominant group. Now, as a Christian, forget the content, we reject that. Of course, there are unjust laws that run counter to God's law, God's moral law, but there is a moral law, and our laws ought to be grounded in God's eternal moral law. And this is actually the position of Martin Luther King in the civil rights movement. He was taking the very traditional Christian approach to law, going back to Augustine and Aquinas. So the bottom line is there are just so many ways in which the assumptions of critical theory, their assumptions about law, about morality, about oppression, about justice, they just fly in the face of basic Christian thinking, that you cannot reconcile the two. I mean, how can you say that all laws are merely mechanisms for social power? No, what about laws against murder? This is nonsense. And yet you'll have people thinking they can square the circle. Not going to work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, what about social binary? What about the social binary? Because I do think we can see how, there is a biblical precedent for the idea that that oppression happens, and sometimes it happens from one group to another. So how do you evaluate and critique that idea in contemporary critical theory?
So first of all, we have to define oppression biblically. So if we define oppression in terms of cruelty and injustice, then yes, oppression exists that way. And oppression can be perpetrated by groups against groups, like the Egyptians and the Israelites. The Egyptians, as a group, oppressed the Israelites by throwing their children in the Nile. That's clear, and enslaving them. That's oppression. So we're not denying that can happen. But what we are denying is, say, that the gender binary is oppressive, because you've redefined the word oppression to include any sense in which some dominant group imposes values. That's not oppression. Oppression involves tyranny and cruel and unjust treatment, defined biblically. Another problem, though, is that critical theory thinks of everything in terms of collectives and groups. So in theory, in principle, yes, you can have a group that oppresses another group, like Egyptians and Israelites. But today we're talking about people being oppressed as a group. They ignore the tremendous influence of your individual advantages on your day-to-day experiences. And we give the example of Oprah. According to critical social theory, Oprah would be a member of at least two oppressed groups. She's black, so she's oppressed because of her race, and she's a woman, so she's oppressed by the patriarchy. But in her actual experienced day-to-day life, is Oprah oppressed, biblically speaking? And the answer is absolutely not. I mean, I think Oprah has $4 billion in net worth. Oprah could buy all of the stuff that I own 1,000, 10,000 times over, right? So there's no sense in which Oprah is experientially day-to-day oppressed. And yet they want to treat her as if she is oppressed, and if she belongs to oppressed class. Well, our point is no. That's not how oppression ought to be understood phenomenologically. And contrary-wise, if you look at a poor, disabled, white, homeless guy, they would say, well, but he's privileged because of his whiteness and his masculinity. And we're saying, but he's homeless and he's poor and he's disabled. They would say, yeah, but he's still privileged. And again, on their worldview, on their definition of privilege, that's the case. But we'd reject that. We'd say, but what really matters is his absolute sense in which he's treated and experiences life. And in that sense, he's not privileged. He would never in a million years exchange, your life for his, even though has white privilege and male privilege. So our point is that there is a sense in which our individualism is real. And other advantages, things like growing up in a two-parent home, having a loving family, being part of God's kingdom. These things are not treated at all by critical social theory, and yet they are, we'd argue, much more relevant to your actual day-to-day experience of life. And one other thing that critical theory can do is it can and does teach people to see themselves as oppressed who are not actually oppressed. So teach it, if you're, a successful black woman who has a wonderful husband and family, but if you go to get a Ph.D. in education, you'll be assaulted on a daily basis with this message that you are actually oppressed. And if you say, well, I don't feel oppressed, they'll say, that's because you have internalized racism and misogyny. You have to get woke and get a critical conscience to see that you're oppressed. And unfortunately, sometimes that works, and people begin to internalize this message that I am actually oppressed, I'm under assault. And they end up being miserable, because who wants to feel like they're constantly being oppressed and everyone's out to get me and I'm in these systems that I can't control that are abusing me? But in reality, though, they're not. They're not actually being assaulted on a daily basis. So again, it can ruin people psychologically to feel, and actually but we cite, the last thing I'll say is, we cite a number of secular scholars. One of the scholars we cite is Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianoff. They talk about, in a book called The Coddling of the American Mind, how college students, there's a mental health crisis among college students, and one of the reasons that they cite in their book, I think they're both atheists, they point out that if you have this framework, and they call it an intersectional framework, that says that you are oppressed all the time by all these unseen forces that are invisible, that you can't control, of course you feel depressed all the time, right? And you're ruining people's mental health because you're telling them constantly, you ought to feel oppressed, you ought to feel like you're a victim because you are. That's a terrible thing to do.
Oh, yeah, and you can see it. You can visibly see it happen to these students. You know, I spend a lot of my time in coffee shops. I have my home office, which is being filmed here, and then I go to coffee shops. That's where I work. And man, over the years, I have seen again and again and again these young, brand new college students start working in the coffee shop. Usually, you see this happening with females more often, but they start out beautiful young woman, happy and smiling, friendly, and then over the course of 1 or 2 semesters, where she's taking classes at our university.
Gender studies, yeah.
I don't even think they're all gender studies majors, but you can see this change physically happen to them. They start dressing differently. They get these haircuts and color their hair green or yellow or purple. But then you can see becoming depressed, and where they were once friendly and happy, and now they look miserable, and they never smile. It's sad. It's sad to see. But as you explain these things, I think that a lot of people in the audience are thinking to themselves, okay, this is obviously completely diametrically opposed to the biblical worldview that I hold. Nevertheless, there are different Christian leaders and thinkers who want to try to bring a biblical worldview and a critical approach together, to where we can maybe continue holding on to our biblical worldview, but use critical theory as a tool, or even bring them together. I'm thinking of the example, I think his name's Chris Watkins, who published the book Biblical Critical Theory. I haven't read the book, but I want to get your thoughts on those kind of projects, and if you have read that book, maybe your thoughts on that book and those types of attempts.
So Watkins' book, the title is terrible. It's not Biblical Critical Theory. I read half the book. It's very, very long. And you can disagree with it, but he has a whole section on why the Marxist oppressor-oppressed binary is wrong and unbiblical. Right? So I think what he's alluded, actually in page 2, he says, I could have called this book, like, now that you're, like, what do you do with what you know biblically? Or how do you live out the Bible? So it seems to me, I'm guessing the publisher was like, ooh, name it Biblical Critical Theory, it'll get a lot of press. Like, that's a terrible decision, but it really, I'm halfway through, unless he springs some trap, it's just about, like, how to understand things like, what is liberation, what is justice, what is identity, what is family, from a biblical perspective. It's all he's doing. So I think the title was just completely misleading. There are, though, other people, like there's a book by Romero and Liao called Christianity and Critical Race Theory, where they attempt to argue that critical race theory is actually helpful and deeply forming, and it's good for Christians, and we can take, they don't agree with all of it, but they think we can take a lot of it, and it dovetails well with biblical thinking. And so there is an overt attempt to marry Christianity and at least aspects of critical race theory there, and I think it's doomed to failure. I think that to the extent, now, we say in the book, we have a whole chapter on the positive insights that critical theorists provide. There are some true things that they say that we can affirm because they're grounded in general revelation. They're just features of God's reality. We can affirm that. A good example is race is a social construct. Yes, it is. Critical race say that a lot. So do we. The Bible says it too. So it's fine to say that and say, yeah, critical race theorists can affirm true things, and so we're not superstitious. But the larger project must be rejected. And the big problem is that Christians oftentimes they'll say things like, well, we can eat the meat and spit out the bones. But they won't tell you what the bones are. They won't tell you what the meat is. You're left to figure that out on your own. And our point is, number one, that's not even a good way to think about it. The analogy we use is saying you're going to eat the meat and spit out the poison. Well, that's different. You can't really do that. The poison's in the meat. That's what makes it dangerous. And so we would argue that would be a better analogy. And so we would say, yes, there are things that you can say are true because they're true independent of critical theory, critical race theory, critical theorists say them to. But we can't adopt this framework. And more than that, we provide, I think we have 770 footnotes plus, 770 plus footnotes. We cite critical theorists in their own words extensively, not just a phrase here and there, but entire block quotes, paragraphs, so you can hear them in their own words what they believe. And when you do that, you quickly realize, I cannot embrace this. When they tell me what they believe and what is a core element of their discipline, a core tenet of their theories, that's false. I can't believe that. And so my question I always pose when people say, well, I can eat the meat and spit out the bones of critical race theory, say. I'll say, how many defining elements of CRT can you reject before you've rejected the whole thing? Because there are the many, quote-unquote, defining elements that are identified by critical race theorists that you must reject as a Christian. And it'd be like saying, well, I can accept Christianity. I'm just going to leave out a few defining elements. Like the resurrection and the Trinity. Well, that's not Christianity anymore.
Yeah.
So, the same way, if you're going to, I can embrace parts of critical race theory, just not these parts. Well, if those parts are the defining elements of CRT, then you can't do that, actually. So that's our argument, and that's why we're so conscientious about footnoting and documenting our sources. That's what they say. Let them speak for themselves. And be fair in treating them, but then I think you have to come to the conclusion, this is not compatible. It's not.
Yeah. Well, I agree. Neil, this has been a great conversation. We could go on for hours talking about all this. There is a lot to unpack, a lot to consider in our culture, but you guys have done an excellent job in this book. The book is called Critical Dilemma. For those of you guys who are wanting to pick up a copy, I will have the book linked in the show notes below. So go down to the description and go to the show notes, and you can find a link to the book there so you can pick up a copy for yourself. Neil, any last thoughts that you want to leave us with other than pointing people to go get the book?
Yeah, I just say pick up the book, definitely. We've done a lot of work on this. We really wanted it to be a resource for the church. Give it to non-Christians. We had, I think, 25 endorsers. 4 of them were secular atheist thinkers who endorsed the book merely because they thought it was a really good book. And we're hoping that people give it to their non-Christian friends just as a resource for them. But it's full of the gospel. It's full of a Christian worldview. And so it can even be a way to have spiritual conversations with them. And we pray that God would use it to save people. I mean, I think there are 440 Bible references, too, in the book. And whole quotes from Ephesians and Genesis. And so, pick up the book. But also pray. Pray for the church. Pray for your church. Pray for... just that we would be able to resist and stand up against these ideas, and that this is a spiritual battle. It's not just a matter of flesh and blood or even bad ideas. It's a matter of ideas that are going to lead people away from Christianity, and so we need to pray against that.
Absolutely. I wholeheartedly second everything you just said. Well, Neil, thanks so much again for coming on the show today. Really enjoyed our time. I appreciate you and Pat's work, your diligent, hard work you've done in all of this. Please keep it up and be encouraged that it's bearing much fruit in spite of whatever pushback you guys get. So thank you so much and appreciate your time today. Thanks for joining us on Filter.
Thanks, Eric.
Every 4 computers now have primary control of critical vehicle functions.